At my son's funeral, my daughter-in-law leaned close to her sister and whispered, "I refuse to look after that old hag." She thought I couldn't hear her. But grief sharpens everything. The chapel was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the soft shuffle of dress shoes against polished floors. The scent of lilies was heavy in the air. My son's casket stood at the front, draped in white and surrounded by framed photographs from every stage of his life. 6 years old, missing his front teeth. 18, in his high school football jersey. 42, standing in front of the house he worked so hard to buy. I stood in the front row, my hands folded gently over my black gloves. I had buried my husband 15 years earlier. I never imagined I would be burying my child. That is not the natural order of things. Behind me, I heard Heather shift her weight impatiently. High heels on marble, a quiet sigh, then the whisper. "I refuse to look after that old hag." Not loud, but clear. Her sister murmured something in response. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The sentence had already landed. People assume older women are fragile at funerals. That grief makes us collapse. They don't understand that grief can also make us still. Very still. I kept my eyes on the casket. Heather's words weren't about emotion. They were about obligation. She wasn't grieving a husband in that moment. She was calculating responsibility. Who would take care of me now? Where would I live? What would happen to the house? That's what her whisper really meant. I felt a familiar sensation settle in my chest, not anger. Recognition. My son had worried about this. Not about me falling apart. About me being pushed aside. 2 weeks before he passed, when the doctors had finally been honest about his prognosis, he asked to speak with me alone. We sat in his hospital room while Heather stepped out to take a call. Machines beeped softly in the background. The Arizona sun filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across his blanket. "Mom," he had said quietly, "I've taken care of it." I didn't ask what he meant. Because I already knew. Now, standing in that chapel, hearing his wife reduce me to an inconvenience before his casket had even been lowered into the ground, I understood why he had looked so determined that day. Heather thought I was the burden. She didn't know what my son had finalized 14 days before he died. The pastor began to speak about legacy. About love. About provision. I listened carefully. Because legacy isn't what people say at a funeral. It's what was prepared before it. When the service ended and people lined up to offer condolences, Heather dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Perfect posture. Controlled sorrow. She avoided meeting my gaze. I didn't confront her. Not there. Not in front of the family. Funerals are not the place for correction. They are the place where truth waits quietly. As the casket was carried out and the bright Arizona sunlight flooded the chapel entrance, I walked slowly behind it. Heather walked beside me. She believed that once the earth covered that grave, control would shift. She believed I would become her responsibility. She was wrong. Because my son had already made sure of one thing. No one would ever have to look after me. And she would find that out very soon. The burial took place under a wide Arizona sky. Bright, unforgiving, almost cruel in its normalcy. The wind moved gently across the cemetery lawn as the casket was lowered into the ground. The pastor spoke softly about peace and eternal rest. Family members clutched tissues. A few of my son's colleagues stood stiffly in dark suits, unsure where to look. Heather stood beside me, her sunglasses covering her eyes now. Composed, controlled. If anyone had heard her whisper earlier, they didn't show it. When the final prayer ended and people began drifting toward their cars, I remained standing for a moment longer. Grief does not rush. Heather's sister approached first. "We'll figure things out," she said carefully. "These transitions can be complicated." There was that word again. Transition. I nodded politely. "Everything is already arranged," I replied. She blinked slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. Arrange. Not pending. Not uncertain. Arrange. At the small gathering afterward, Hosted at Daniel and Heather's house. The tone shifted from mourning to logistics. Casserole dishes lined the kitchen counter. Coffee brewed continuously. Conversations lowered into practical whispers. "Will she stay here?" someone murmured. "Maybe it's time to downsize," another voice suggested. I sat quietly in a chair near the window, listening. Heather moved through the room, accepting condolences, thanking guests. When she passed by me, she paused. "We'll need to talk soon," she said softly. "About what?" She didn't need to clarify. I met her gaze evenly. "Yes," I said, "we will." She nodded, satisfied. She believed the conversation would be about my care. About living arrangements. About responsibility. She still thought I was becoming her obligation. Later that evening, after the house had emptied and the sun dipped below the desert horizon, I drove home alone. The house greeted me in silence. The same entryway. The same framed photos along the hallway. Daniel at 7, covered in dirt after Little League practice. Daniel at 22, holding the keys to his first car. Daniel last Christmas, standing beside me in this very living room. I placed my purse on the table and walked slowly into the kitchen. Grief settled heavily, but beneath it was something steadier. Certainty. 2 weeks before he died, Daniel had insisted on one more meeting. Not at home. At his attorney's office. Heather had been at work. He signed documents carefully, deliberately. He didn't explain everything to me then. He simply said, "I don't want you depending on anyone." Now I understood the weight of that sentence. Heather thought the funeral marked the beginning of my vulnerability. She thought her whisper was about future inconvenience. What she didn't realize was that my son had already anticipated this moment. And he had prepared accordingly. The question wasn't whether someone would look after me. The question was whether she would understand what had already been decided. She would. Very soon. The morning after the funeral, the house felt too quiet. Not empty. Just altered. Grief changes the way sound travels. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt louder. The ticking clock in the hallway seemed sharper. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the backyard Daniel used to mow when he visited on Sundays. He always said it helped him think. 2 weeks before he passed, he had come here alone. Heather thought he was running errands. He wasn't. He sat at this same kitchen table, thinner than I had ever seen him, but clear-eyed. "Mom," he said gently, "I need to make sure you're protected." I remember brushing it off. "I've managed just fine," I told him. He nodded. "I know, that's exactly why." At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. Now I understood he meant legally. That afternoon, as I sorted through condolence cards, my phone rang. It was his attorney. "We'll need you present for the formal reading of the will," he said in a calm, professional tone, "early next week." I felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Expectation. "Will Heather be there?" I asked. "Yes," he replied, "all immediate family." Immediate family. The phrase carried weight. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself to think about the past few years. Daniel had always been generous. Too generous. When he and Heather bought their home, I helped with the down payment. Not because they asked, because I wanted them secure. When my grandson was born, I covered part of the hospital bill quietly. Heather thanked me politely but distantly. And over time, I noticed small shifts. Conversations about finances became more frequent. Heather would mention rising property taxes, mortgage adjustments, investment plans. Always casual. Always framed as shared stress. But sometimes, when she looked at my house, this house, there was calculation in her eyes. Not cruelty. Calculation. 2 months before Daniel's diagnosis became terminal, he had called me late one evening. "Have you ever thought about moving in with us?" he asked. The question surprised me. "No," I said honestly. "Why would I?" He paused. "I just don't want you alone." "I'm not alone," I told him. "I'm independent." There is a difference. He didn't argue. He just listened. Now, replaying that conversation, I realized something. He wasn't asking because he wanted me closer. He was asking because he was gauging future pressure. He knew. He knew Heather would eventually frame it as responsibility. That I would become a decision to manage. The attorney's call wasn't about distribution yet. It was about structure. Daniel had insisted everything be finalized while he was still clear-headed. Medical evaluations documented, signatures witnessed. Not rushed. Deliberate. Heather believed the funeral marked the beginning of her authority. But authority doesn't transfer with grief. It transfers with paperwork. And my son had already signed his. As I closed the stack of sympathy cards and placed them neatly back in their box, I understood something simple. Heather's whisper had been about obligation. Daniel's preparation had been about protection. One of those would carry weight. And very soon, we would all see which one it was. The will reading was scheduled for Tuesday morning. 10 a.m. Downtown Scottsdale, third floor of a quiet brick building that smelled faintly of polished wood and printer ink. I arrived 10 minutes early. Heather and her sister walked in together 5 minutes later. Heather wore a black dress again, though the funeral had already passed. Controlled, composed, prepared. She nodded at me politely. No whisper this time. The attorney greeted us and led us into a conference room. A long wooden table, bottled water placed neatly in front of each seat. A single folder resting near the head of the table. Structure. That's what I noticed first. Daniel's name printed clearly across the front of the file. We sat. The attorney began with formal language, dates, signatures, confirmation of sound mind and medical documentation. He emphasized that Daniel had updated everything 2 weeks prior to his passing. 2 weeks. Heather shifted slightly in her chair. I wasn't aware there were changes, she said, her tone still measured. He requested privacy for that meeting. The attorney replied calmly. I kept my hands folded in my lap. No reaction. The attorney continued. Primary residence. Transferred into a revocable trust several years ago. Heather looked at me briefly. She hadn't known that. Beneficiary structure remained intact. Then came the sentence that altered the air in the room. Administrative control of the trust assets is not granted solely to the surviving spouse. Heather's back straightened. Excuse me? She asked. The attorney continued evenly. An independent fiduciary has been appointed. Major financial decisions regarding the property and investment accounts require dual authorization. Dual. Not singular. Heather's lips pressed thin. And what about caregiving arrangements? Her sister asked carefully. The attorney glanced at his notes. There is no legal obligation requiring Mrs. Carter to reside with or depend upon any specific family member. Mrs. Carter. That was me. I felt the weight of Daniel's preparation settle fully. Heather believed I would become her responsibility. Daniel had ensured I would remain autonomous. The life insurance policy, the attorney continued, is divided into 2 structured allocations. One portion supports the minor child's education fund. The other establishes a separate account for Mrs. Carter's independent living security. Independent living security. The phrase was deliberate. Heather exhaled slowly. So she doesn't need assistance? She asked. The attorney met her gaze directly. Mrs. Carter's financial stability has been protected. Silence filled the room. Not dramatic. Decisive. Daniel hadn't left chaos behind. He left clarity. Heather's whisper at the funeral had been about inconvenience. This meeting was about structure. I finally spoke. My son didn't want anyone burdened, I said quietly. Including me. Heather avoided my eyes. For the first time since the funeral, I saw uncertainty replace calculation. She had assumed authority would flow naturally toward her. But authority does not flow through assumption. It flows through documentation. And Daniel had signed every page. The meeting ended with formal instructions and future timelines. As we stood to leave, Heather paused near the door. You knew, she said softly. Yes, I replied. Not smug. Not triumphant. Simply honest. She had whispered about not looking after me. What she didn't realize was this. No one would have to. Because my son had already made sure of that. When we stepped out of the attorney's office, the Arizona sun felt sharper than it had that morning. Heather walked a few steps ahead of me toward the parking garage. Her heels clicked against the concrete. Faster than usual. Daniel would have walked beside me. He always did. Now there was space where he should have been. Heather stopped beside her car and turned toward me. I didn't realize he changed things that much, she said, keeping her voice controlled. He didn't change them, I replied. He clarified them. There's a difference. She folded her arms loosely. I thought everything would just flow naturally. Naturally. That word again. I met her eyes evenly. Nothing about loss is natural, I said. Preparation is. She didn't argue. Because she couldn't. The structure had been explained in plain language. Independent fiduciary, dual authorization, protected accounts, no automatic control. No obligation to house me. No dependency clause. Daniel hadn't punished her. He had simply removed assumption. That afternoon, I drove home alone. The house felt the same as it had before the meeting, steady. Quiet, unchanged. I walked into the living room and sat in the chair Daniel used to claim whenever he visited. The leather was worn slightly on one armrest from years of his elbow resting there. I closed my eyes for a moment. Grief doesn't disappear when paperwork is read. It just shifts. There was comfort in knowing he had thought of me clearly. Not emotionally, not hurriedly, clearly. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Heather. I'd like to talk, she said. Of course, I replied. She came over that evening. No sister, no attorney, no formal setting. Just the two of us at my kitchen table. I wasn't trying to be cruel at the funeral. She began. I know, I said. Cruelty would have been easier to confront. Calculation is quieter. I just panicked. She continued. I didn't know what would happen next. You assumed I would become part of your responsibility, I said calmly. She hesitated. Yes. The honesty surprised me. And that frightened you, I added. She nodded slowly. Heather isn't heartless. She is practical. And practicality, under pressure, often looks like self-protection. I never intended to depend on you, I said gently. Daniel knew that. She looked down at her hands. He never told me he structured it that way. He wanted clarity, I replied. Not conflict. Clarity. Silence settled between us, but it wasn't hostile. It was recalibrating. You don't need us, she said finally. I have you, I answered. I just don't depend on you. That distinction matters. Dependency breeds resentment. Independence allows relationship. When she left, she paused at the door. I shouldn't have said what I said, she admitted quietly. No dramatic apology. Just recognition. After the door closed, I stood in the hallway where Daniel's childhood height marks still faintly showed on the wall. 6 years old. 10. 16. He had grown under this roof. And before he left this world, he made sure I could remain under it without fear. Heather's whisper had been about burden. Daniel's documents were about protection. One was emotional. The other was structural. Structure always lasts longer. The days after the will reading were quieter than I expected. No confrontation. No dramatic fallout. Just adjustment. Heather didn't call for 3 days. When she finally did, her tone had changed. Mom, she said carefully, the first time she had called me that without hesitation, I wanted to ask something. Yes? Would you like to come to dinner on Sunday? Just us. No agenda mentioned. No paperwork implied. Of course, I said. Sunday evening felt different from the gathering after the funeral. The house still carried Daniel's absence. But the tension that had hovered over logistics was gone. My grandson ran toward me the moment I stepped through the door. Grandma, Mom says you're staying in your house forever. Children say things plainly. I smiled gently. I'm staying in my house, I corrected. Forever is a word adults use to calm fear. Heather overheard and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. At dinner, conversation stayed on simple topics: school schedules, work deadlines, the Arizona heat finally beginning to soften. Halfway through the meal, Heather set down her fork. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about independence." I waited. "I realize now that I confused care with control," she continued. "I thought if you depended on us, it would make things clearer." "Clearer for whom?" I asked gently. She looked down briefly. "For me. Honesty doesn't need volume. I don't want to replace Daniel's role," she added quietly. "I just didn't know what my role was supposed to be." There it was. The real fear. Not obligation. Uncertainty. "You're his wife," I said calmly, "and the mother of his son. That hasn't changed." "But you're not under us," she said carefully. "No," I replied, "I'm beside you." That distinction shifted something in the room. Daniel had structured the finances to prevent power imbalance. Now we were structuring the relationship the same way. After dinner, Daniel walked me to my car. "I'm glad he handled it the way he did," he said. "So am I," I answered. Because I didn't realize how easy it would have been for things to get complicated. Complication comes from assumption. Clarity prevents it. Driving home under the soft glow of streetlights, I realized something important. Heather's whisper at the funeral had been rooted in fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of loss. Fear of instability. Daniel had removed the financial pressure. Now it was up to us to remove the emotional one. When I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, the house greeted me the same way it always had. Solid. Unapologetic. Independent. No one needed to look after me. And because of that, no one needed to resent me either. That was Daniel's real gift. Not money. Not property. Balance. And balance, once established, allows grief to become family again. A few weeks passed, and routine began to return. Not the old routine. A new one. Daniel started coming by on Saturday mornings again. Not out of obligation, out of habit. He'd bring coffee from the place on Main Street I like. The one that roasts their beans dark and strong. We'd sit at the kitchen table where he once did homework. Where he signed documents 2 weeks before he died. Structure had been finalized there. Now relationship was being rebuilt there. "Mom," he said one morning, stirring sugar into his cup. I didn't realize how much pressure Heather was feeling. "I know," I replied. Pressure isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, persistent, practical. She thought if something happened to me, everything would fall on her. He continued, "You, the house, the accounts." "And she didn't feel ready," I said gently. He nodded. She panicked. That word again. Not cruelty. Panic. When panic meets assumption, people say things they can't take back. Like at a funeral. Later that afternoon, Heather came by with my grandson. She carried a small container of cookies, homemade, slightly overbaked around the edges. Not perfect, but sincere. "I wanted to stop by," she said, "if that's okay." "It always is," I answered. We sat in the living room while my grandson played with the wooden train set Daniel had kept in the attic. Heather watched him quietly for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about being beside each other, not under." "That matters," I replied. She nodded slowly. "I didn't grow up with this kind of structure," she admitted. "In my family, when someone passed, everything became chaotic. People fought. Things were unclear. Clarity can feel cold if you've only known chaos." "Daniel didn't want that," I said softly. "No," she agreed. "He didn't." There was no defensiveness in her voice now. Just understanding. "I shouldn't have said what I said at the funeral," she continued. "It came from fear, not from how I actually see you." "I know," I said. And I did. Because if she truly saw me as a burden, she wouldn't be sitting here trying to rebuild something. The trust documents hadn't just protected my finances. They had removed imbalance. Without imbalance, there's less resentment. Without resentment. There's room for repair. As the sun lowered over the desert and painted long shadows across the backyard, my grandson ran outside, laughing. Heather followed him to the patio. I stood in the doorway for a moment and watched them. Family doesn't survive because there's no conflict. It survives because structure prevents conflict from becoming damage. Daniel had anticipated pressure. He had reduced it. Now the rest was up to us. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something steady settle into place. Not relief. Not victory. Stability. The kind that allows grief to breathe without turning into division. Heather once whispered that she refused to look after me. Now she understood something different. She didn't have to. And because of that, she could simply be family. By early spring, the house no longer felt like a point of tension. It felt like what it had always been. Home. Daniel came by one afternoon with a toolbox and replaced the loose handle on the back gate without being asked. Heather texted me recipes she thought I might like. Small gestures. Not obligation. Connection. One Sunday, they invited me over for lunch. Not a formal gathering, no extended family, just us. The dining table felt different this time. Not heavy. Not careful. Normal. Halfway through the meal, my grandson looked up and asked, "Grandma, are you still living in your house?" "I am," I said with a smile. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his mashed potatoes. Children don't carry adult tension for long. Heather set down her glass and looked at me directly. "I realized something," she said, "when Daniel set up everything the way he did. He wasn't just protecting you." I waited. He was protecting all of us. That was the first time she had framed it that way. "How so?" I asked gently. "If things had been unclear," she said, "I would have felt responsible for decisions I wasn't ready to make. And you would have felt dependent on someone you didn't need to depend on." She wasn't wrong. Unclear structure creates emotional strain. Clear structure creates space. Daniel's planning didn't divide us. It removed leverage. And when leverage disappears, so does fear. "I never wanted to control anything," she continued. "I just didn't want to lose control." Grief often disguises itself as control. We nodded at each other, not in agreement about the past, but in understanding about the present. After lunch, Daniel walked me to my car again. "I keep thinking about that day in the hospital," he said, "when he told you he'd taken care of it." "He knew what pressure does," I replied. Daniel looked down for a moment. "I'm glad he didn't leave us to figure it out blindly." "So am I said. Because blind grief can turn into blame. Structure prevented that. When I returned home, I stepped inside and paused in the hallway. The house didn't feel like an asset. It felt like a promise fulfilled. Heather's whisper at the funeral had come from fear of responsibility. Now she understood something simpler. No one had to look after me. And because of that, she no longer had to defend herself from that role. That shift mattered. Not legally. Emotionally. The trust documents had done their work. Now the relationship was doing its own. Stability isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply holds. And when something holds long enough, people stop trying to move it. They begin to trust it instead. That was the real change. Not who owned what, but who no longer felt threatened by it. By late spring, something subtle had changed in the way Heather spoke to me. Not just politeness. Respect. It showed in small ways. She no longer framed conversations around what would, eventually, happen. She no longer referenced the future as something I would need to prepare for under her supervision. Instead, she asked. One afternoon, she called. "Would you like to come with us to Daniel's favorite hiking trail this weekend?" she asked. "We're scattering some of his ashes near the overlook." Her voice was steady. Not cautious. Steady. "I would," I said. Saturday morning, we drove out toward the desert preserve just outside Scottsdale. The sun wasn't harsh yet, but the heat was beginning to rise. The air smelled like dry earth and sagebrush. We walked slowly along the trail, My grandson ran ahead with Daniel, stopping every few feet to pick up rocks and ask questions. Heather walked beside me. No tension. Just quiet. At the overlook, Daniel opened the small urn carefully. The wind carried the dust gently across the canyon. We stood together, not separated by roles, not divided by assumptions. Just family. Afterward, we sat on a flat rock and watched the horizon. I keep thinking about that day at the funeral, Heather said softly. I didn't interrupt. I was afraid, she continued, not of you, of everything changing at once. Loss rearranges identity. Widow. Single parent. Decision maker. Responsibility feels heavier when it arrives without warning. I thought if I had control over the practical things, I could survive the emotional ones, she admitted. That's understandable, I said. But I said something I can't take back. No, I replied gently, you can't. Truth doesn't disappear. It just settles. But I'm grateful he planned the way he did, she added, because if he hadn't, I might have pushed harder. And that would have damaged more than money. She was right. Unclear structure breeds conflict. Conflict during grief turns permanent. Daniel had prevented that. On the drive home, my grandson fell asleep in the back seat, his head tilted awkwardly against the window. Heather adjusted the rearview mirror to check on him. He protected all of us, she said quietly. Yes, I answered. Not just financially. Emotionally. By removing uncertainty, he removed competition. By defining boundaries, he preserved relationships. When we pulled into my driveway, Daniel stepped out and hugged me tightly. Thank you for standing firm, he said. I didn't stand against you, I replied. I stood where I already was. That difference matters. Heather once whispered that she refused to look after me. Now she understood she never had to. And because she didn't have to carry that fear, she could carry something else instead. Respect. The house remained mine. The trust remained intact. But what truly shifted wasn't ownership. It was balance. And balance, once restored, allows grief to become love again. Summer arrived quietly. In Arizona, summer doesn't ask permission. It settles in early, stretching the days longer and pushing everyone indoors by mid-afternoon. But inside my house, nothing felt pressured. Daniel and Heather had adjusted to the structure. Not reluctantly, intentionally. One evening, they came over for dinner. I grilled chicken on the patio while my grandson set the table with exaggerated seriousness. Grandma, you still live here because Grandpa built it strong, right? He asked. I smiled. Yes, I said, and because your dad made sure it stayed that way. Daniel looked at me across the table. There was no tension in his expression now, just understanding. After we ate, Heather stayed behind while Daniel took their son to the car. I've been thinking about something, she said quietly. I waited. If things had gone differently, if there hadn't been clear documents, I might have tried to convince you to move. She didn't look away when she said it. I know, I replied. And I would have justified it as practical. She continued, safer, easier, logical. Practical can still feel like displacement, I said gently. She nodded. That's what I understand now. There was no defensiveness in her voice. Just clarity. I didn't want to become the person who resented you, she admitted, but I could see how that might have happened. Unspoken fear becomes resentment. Resentment becomes fracture. Daniel had removed the first step. He didn't just protect you, she said softly, he protected our marriage. That was something I hadn't considered directly. Without structure, grief would have turned into negotiation. Negotiation would have turned into pressure. Pressure would have turned into blame. Instead, everything had been defined before it needed to be debated. When Daniel came back inside to say goodbye, he hugged me a little longer than usual. I'm proud of how you handled everything, he said. I didn't handle anything, I replied. Your father taught me to prepare. And Daniel had learned that lesson well. After they left, I walked through the quiet house slowly. The hallway photographs hadn't changed. The kitchen table where documents had once been signed still stood in the same place. But something deeper had shifted. Heather no longer saw me as responsibility. Daniel no longer felt torn between loyalty and practicality. My grandson saw this house not as an asset, but as continuity. That is what structure accomplishes when it's done early. It removes uncertainty before uncertainty can damage trust. Heather's whisper at the funeral had come from fear of obligation. Now there was no obligation. Only relationship. And relationship, when free of imbalance, has room to heal. The trust remained intact. The accounts remained protected. But what truly endured wasn't financial. It was respect. And respect, once earned through clarity, lasts longer than grief ever could. By early fall, the air began to cool in the evenings. Arizona sunsets stretched longer, softer, the kind that turn the sky pale orange before fading into lavender. It had been several months since the funeral. Several months since that whisper. Life had not returned to what it was before. It had settled into something steadier. Daniel started coming over on Thursday nights again, the way he used to before everything changed. Sometimes he brought takeout. Sometimes we just sat on the patio and talked while the ceiling fan hummed quietly above us. One evening, he looked at me and said, "I've been thinking about the word she used." I knew which word he meant. I refused to look after that old hag. He didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. I didn't realize how much fear was underneath that sentence. He said quietly. "Fear doesn't excuse it," I replied. "No," he agreed, "but it explains it." Explanation is not the same as justification. But it can prevent repetition. Heather had changed in subtle ways. She no longer positioned herself as decision-maker in conversations about my future. She asked about my garden, about my walking routine, about the community classes I'd started attending. Not because she needed to manage me. Because she wanted to understand me. One afternoon, she stopped by alone. "I know I can't undo what I said," she began. "No," I answered gently. "But I want you to know something," she continued. "When Daniel set everything up the way he did, I felt excluded. Now I realize I was being protected too. That was growth. Protection sometimes feels like exclusion to the person who expects control. But control and protection are not the same thing. If he hadn't made things clear," she added, "I would have tried to fill in the gaps. And that would have damaged us." She meant all of us. Grief without clarity creates power struggles. Power struggles create fractures. Daniel removed the gaps. And because there were no gaps, there was nothing to fight over. I looked at her carefully. "You don't have to look after me," I said. She gave a small, almost relieved smile. "I know," she replied. That was the difference now. She didn't feel burdened. I didn't feel threatened. Balance had replaced tension. After she left, I walked into the hallway and paused beside the framed photo of Daniel at 18. Standing tall in his graduation gown. He had grown into a man who understood something many people don't. Love is emotional. Protection is structural. He gave me both. Heather once whispered that she refused to take care of me. Now she understood she never needed to. Because I was never helpless. I was prepared. And preparation, when done quietly and early, doesn't just protect assets. It protects relationships. That was his final gift. Not money. Not property. Clarity. And clarity had restored something more valuable than inheritance. It restored respect. 1 year after the funeral, we gathered again. Same cemetery. Same stretch of desert sky. Same quiet wind moving through the grass. But we were not the same people. My grandson held a small framed photo of his father this time, the one taken in front of this very house. Sunlight behind him, hand resting on my shoulder. Heather stood beside me, close enough that our arms brushed. Not accidentally. Intentionally. We placed fresh white roses at the base of the headstone. The stone no longer looked new. It had settled into the earth the way grief settles into the body, present. But no longer sharp. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Heather did. I've replayed that day in the chapel more times than I can count. She said quietly. I didn't ask which part. We both knew. I thought I was preparing myself. She continued. For responsibility, for pressure, for everything changing. You were afraid, I said gently. Yes. She looked at Daniel's name carved into the granite. But he had already prepared. She added, not just legally, emotionally. That was the truth. Daniel didn't leave chaos behind. He left clarity. And clarity gave us space to grieve without turning against each other. My grandson slipped his hand into mine. Grandma, Dad made sure you're okay, he said confidently. I smiled. He did. Not because I was helpless. Because he understood something important. Love is not just expressed in words at a funeral. It is written into structure long before one happens. As we walked back toward the cars, Heather slowed her steps. I don't feel burdened anymore, she admitted softly. You were never meant to, I replied. That was the full circle. At the funeral, she whispered she refused to look after me. Today, she understands she never had to. When I returned home that afternoon, I stood in the hallway for a moment. The same framed photographs lined the wall. The same kitchen table where Daniel once signed documents still stood steady under the window. The same pencil marks measured his childhood growth. Nothing had shifted. And that stability was the point. He had protected my independence before grief could threaten it. He had defined boundaries before fear could distort them. Because of that, no one resented me. No one felt trapped by obligation. And no one had to compete for control. The trust remains intact. The accounts remain clear. But more importantly, the family remains intact. That is the real inheritance. Not money. Not property. Balance. When someone whispers about your future before you are ready, it can feel like erasure. But if you have prepared, calmly, deliberately, without drama, your place cannot be removed by fear. My son understood that. He protected me without humiliating his wife. He clarified everything without creating conflict. And in doing so, he gave us something far more valuable than assets. He gave us dignity. And that is how this story ends. Not with revenge. Not with exile. But with respect, restored, steady, and earned.